Welcome back to New Record Day. My name is Ron, and in today's episode of Tuesday Tech Talks, offered up by Danny Richie of GR Research, speaker burn-in, fact or fiction? Let's find out.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another Tuesday's Tech Talk. It's good to be back, and it's good to be back into technical discussions. That's what we're going to have today. I know we've had some fun with all the upgrades. We did the long upgrade of the Klipsch RP600 and the Klipsch Forte 3 that we did last week, and the fun we had with Tyson and all that stuff. That was big fun, and thank you everyone who's been watching. Appreciate your views. But today we're going to get right back into the technical stuff, and we're going to talk about, I guess, what we'd call a hot topic in a way. We're going to talk about speaker break-in or speaker burn-in. Not that it's really a hot topic, but it's one of those topics that tends to push people's buttons a little bit. I know there's a bunch of the flat earth guys out there that are going to freak out as soon as they see this title of this episode. They're going to want to jump in there and hit the dislike button and say something about snake oil and double-blind testing and all that same stuff that you get bashed with anytime there's a free discussion of information regarding any of these topics. It's almost as bad as some of the cable topics. But I'm going to try to hit you guys with some truth. Give you some real information and something you can really kind of hang your hat on. I guess too, let me address what I just said before about the flat earth guys. Why do I call them that, and is that a derogatory statement? Yeah, it's kind of derogatory. It's kind of poking at them a little bit. What does it mean? It means when you are letting a preconceived idea like the world is flat get in the way of your ability to learn and understand new things. And that's perfectly describes those guys. When you start talking about how a certain cable sounded versus your other cable and things like that, you get from those guys either no, or you get bashed for saying those things. And this isn't I'm not putting this information up there to start one of those things. So if you're interested in coming in and just throwing in a bunch of those comments, just forget it. I'm not going to get dragged into a debate. I'm going to give you real, honest information that can be backed up. Real science, not pie in the sky stuff, or trying to teach you that the world is flat and convert you to a belief system or something crazy like that. So there's also a web page out there that's somewhat devoted towards beating up the audiophiles and hitting these topics about cables and burn-in and things like that. And they push a lot of disinformation, a lot of information that's just not factual at all. And this is one of those topics. And I went to their webpage. I've got some information here that they try to push on it. They'll have you believe that speaker burn-in or speaker break-in all takes place in the first 10 seconds. And that's it. And they've got a whole page on it, and they'll have you believe that the speaker break-in not only takes place in just 10 seconds, but that it's going to create about a 5% change in compliance, and that's it. And if you look on their website, there's a bunch of technical jargon that they've come up with. They've got a couple of drivers here they've posted some parameters on, and they've taken those parameters and, like the VAS, and since their theory is that it's going to create a 5% change in compliance, they get new numbers derived. Notice it's derived from the original, and they simply take the original VAS and they multiply it times 1.05, and they get the new number. And if you look, the new number is all the way out to the fourth decimal place, perfect for 1.05. Same with the smaller woofer here. They've got VAS, and they just multiply it times 1.05, and they get the new VAS. So, was there any science behind this at all? No. They didn't do any work. They didn't take any measurements. It was just something that they came up with, and it's sad because a lot of people will point to this on this website and say, see this website here, that they proved it, and they didn't prove anything. They didn't even back up their theory. All they did was just create a theory that it would just be a 5% change and that it would take 10 seconds, none of which is is really true. So if you look on our website, we've hit this a couple of times. Originally, we took one of our little M130 drivers and we put it through some of these processes that you hear about on the internet, and I'll go through it, just a little bit of it here, and we'll summarize some of the numbers. I'd love for you to go to our website, look over on the left-hand column, go all the way down to the bottom. This one's called Driver Burn-In Facts. And of course, a lot of these guys, well, first thing they'll tell you is that it doesn't burn in. It's your ears that burn in, which is funny. If your ears are listening to a speaker, and typically when one's fresh out of the box, it's typically a little harsher, a little harder to listen to, a little fatiguing when it's right out of the box. You don't get used to listening to that. The more you listen to something that's fatiguing, the more fatiguing you get, and you don't want to listen to it. So that's not what's happening. Your ears aren't getting used to it. The speaker is actually changing, and it's softening, and the presentation is changing, and it's getting easier to listen to. It's not your ears that are changing. The drivers are really changing, and they're changing quite a bit in some cases. There's two things that are going on also. There's an electrical break-in that your speakers go through, and there's a mechanical break-in. Electrical break-in would be like what your capacitors go through, your wiring, your connectors, things like that, and even the voice coil of the drivers are all subject to an electrical burn-in effect or break-in effect. And then there's the mechanical compliance of the drivers that are just going to simply change from the amount of use that you put them through. And that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to look at just those things. If we really start digging into the electrical burn-in, the flat Earth guys' heads are going to explode, and I don't want to kill anybody today with this factual information. I just want to help some people. So we're just going to look at the mechanical changes today, and we're going to go through that stuff. So I took one of the M130s and I took some measurements on it fresh out of the box, and you can see the measurements that are posted there. And then I took on one of the myths that you can just take the driver and you can just slowly press it all the way in and all the way out and just stretch the suspension and give it a good hard stretch and kind of break the bonds of the suspension and the spider here a little bit, and that will be all that you need. All you need to do is just stretch it all the way, and that does do some things. I mean, it really does break some of the bonds within that fabric and the coatings that are on the spider, and it's going to stretch that out a little bit, and it'll make a little bit of a change. Not much. I took some measurements on one after doing that. It made a very minuscule change. Not much at all, but it does make some difference. Now, the next myth out there was that you could just run it for 10 seconds and that 10 seconds would do it. Well, I ran it for 10 seconds, and as soon as it was through running for 10 seconds, I took some measurements. And there's some change after 10 seconds, but mostly due to the fact that you've heated up the voice coil. Once you've played something hard and beat on it near X max for 10 seconds, you've warmed it up a little bit. So then the next thing I did was let it cool off back to room temperature and take the measurements again. And when that happened, you could see that the measurements were pretty much right back where they were to begin with. Next thing we did on the little M130s was that we actually played them hard for a while. On this next test, I think I played them for 20 hours. So after playing for 20 hours, took some new measurements, and now we're seeing some more significant changes in the compliance. I then let it cool back to room temperature, took some measurements again, and a lot of that change stayed. I mean, it actually really changed the parameters a little bit. And then I went in and done it. I measured it again after another 20 hours of burning time. So we put 40 hours on it, and again, parameters changed. We measured it when it was hot. We measured it after it cooled off. So with a total of 40 hours of burning time, there was pretty significant changes you could see in the FS, in the VAS, all the Q parameters. All those things changed, and it just takes a long time for those things to take place. They just don't take place the first time you turn it on. It takes a while for it to soften the suspension up and have an effect. The next section there on our webpage, right below that, there's another link that says Burn-In Myths Busted. And this time I went right at some of those myths that we see out there on the internet and disproved a lot of those, and took a whole group of drivers, and I contacted Matasound and I contacted Speaker City, and I asked them for some samples of some different speakers, different drivers, and things that they had, and they both graciously sent some stuff out to me that I could use for burning in process, and just return them when we were through with them. And so I did a whole group of drivers, measured all the still small parameters when they were fresh, did it again after 1 minute, did it again after 5 minutes, did it again after an hour, took measurements again after 10 hours, 20 hours, 40 hours, and 80 hours. This one took some time, folks, and but I wanted to be thorough. I let them cool after running them in each group for that amount of time. Let them cool, and back to room temperature, and did the measurements. And what we would see is incrementally those measurements would change based on how much time you put on them. You would see a little bit more at first, and then over time it would be less and less, but you'd still continue to see burn-in effects. And typically on any woofer, we recommend 80 to 100 hours is about what it takes to reach what we feel like is somewhat of a settled in period, or a settled point. It never really completely settles. It's kind of like this. It's kind of if we're at point A and totally burned in is at point B. When you first put about 10 hours or more on it, let's say you move about halfway there, and then you double that, put another 20 hours on it, you move about halfway there again. Then you put another 40 hours of time on it, you move halfway there again. Put another 80 hours on it, you move halfway there again. So pretty soon you're having to put longer and longer amounts of time to make little small incremental changes in the compliance. It never really completely settles. It could still continue to get a little softer and a little softer, but it reaches a point where it takes a long time to move the needle any, so it makes it a lot harder and harder to get any change out of it. So at some point around 80 to 100 hours, we say that's pretty much a settled in spot. So what did we learn when I burned in all those different drivers? The one myth that I took in is that the speakers don't burn in, it's your ears that burn in. We mentioned that one before. That's busted. The speaker definitely burns in, there's no question about it. And then the myth that what break-in occurs in the driver occurs within the first few seconds of operation, that's also busted. It doesn't happen in the first few seconds. It takes a long time. And then there was the myth that within just a few minutes of the stimulus being turned off, that most, if not all, of the compliance change will completely recover and it will revert back to its original specifications. That's busted. No, it softens up and it stays softened up. And then there's the myth that drivers whose parameters change over time are defective, that somehow they're defective in some way because their compliance changes. That's busted as well. That takes place with any driver. It doesn't matter what brand it is, what type it is. Anytime you're moving anything, whether it's a piece of metal, a piece of paper, and you're flexing it a lot, it's going to soften it up. That's just the simple physics of it. So what's going on? The woofer itself has a suspension and a compliance to the suspension that's made up of the surround. It's made up of what we call a spider, and that's what holds the woofer and allows it to be centered over the voice coil. Now the spider, I've got a couple of little samples here. Some spiders are fairly stiff, some are softer. Some, like this one, are softer more towards the outside. They get stiffer as it gets more towards the middle. This one may be that way as well. So when the woofer starts moving, it's stretching this fabric out and it's softening up, and that's what's giving you a lot of the change in compliance. So what's making the difference in what we hear? I know people are always talking about how their speaker sounded after it was burned in versus when it was fresh, and we've done this a lot. Every speaker that we design and build, we listen to it extensively, and you can almost always tell when it's fresh out of the box, and there's a very predictable change that takes place after that period of time has passed where it's really burned in for a while. And I know people post online about how it sounded in the beginning and how it's starting to come around after so many hours. And that's true. It'll start to come around after so much time that you put on it. So what's going on here? Why is it sounding different? And you'll get the guys that'll say, well, let's take a measurement of it. Let's look at the frequency response and see if it measures different. Well, it does measure different, but you're not going to see it in the frequency response. If you're looking at it for the frequency response, you're looking at the wrong thing. Think of it as you're softening the suspension on your car. Let's say you have a car and it's got airbag suspension or hydraulics or air shocks on the back like we did in the old days, and you crank that pressure way up and the car sits up real proud and stiff, or the suspension's all the way up, and every time you hit a bump, that thing just bounces over everything. It's just a rough ride, and it takes a long time for it to settle. That's more like what a driver is when it's fresh out of the box. That suspension's stiff, and it just takes a longer amount of time for it to settle. So once it softens up, it's like your suspension on your car has softened, and you feel that bump, and it settles pretty easily and pretty quickly. That's kind of what's going on in these woofers. Whenever they've reached a level of their compliance where they've softened up a little bit, they tend to settle a little more easily and a little more quickly. And you're not going to see that in a frequency response. That would be like saying, in frequency response is looking at the amplitude output over frequency. So it's kind of like watching your car accelerate over a certain given distance. And you're saying, I'm saying, hey, we're going to change your suspension to softer shocks. And you're saying, well, let's see if it accelerates faster from 0 to 100. It's not going to accelerate any faster from 0 to 100. It's just going to ride smoother. And it's the same way with the suspension softening on the woofer. It's not going to play louder. It's not going to play any softer. It's going to pretty much be within the same range that it was, but it's going to settle faster in some ranges. So if we look at the measurements on that, what we really look at is the spectral decay. In the spectral decay, you can see some changes once the speaker's burned in. Now, not a lot usually, because it's hard to see those changes in the spectral decay because they're lower down in frequency. It's hard to measure a speaker lower down in frequency range outside of an anechoic chamber and get any kind of reasonable measurements on it. Here, when we measure speakers, we get out 1 meter away, and we use what's called a gated time window. So we're just looking at when the sound leaves the speaker, when it reaches the microphone, and we're stopping that signal before all the room reflections and things can reach the microphone. So we're looking at it anechoically, without echo, but only for a short given time. When we do that, we can only measure accurately down to about 200 to 300 hertz. So to measure lower in frequency and to measure lower in frequency accurately, the microphone has to get much further away. When your microphone gets much further away, you can't really gate out those room reflections. You need to be in an anechoic chamber or something so that you don't have those reflections in the room. So it gets really tough to measure accurately below 200 or 300 hertz. And when you look at a spectral decay, it's actually starting to calculate that decay rate from the impulse response and to put it on that chart for you, and it loses a lot of accuracy down there in the lower frequency range. So it's really hard to see it in some cases, but in some cases you can clearly see it. I've measured woofers where we're looking at the spectral decay, and we've run them in over long periods of time, and you look at that spectral decay again and it's cleaner. It's dropping off faster. So what does that mean when you hear it? What that means when you hear it is a faster recovering rate. So when you hear a bass note or mid-range, some of the vocals, it's settling faster, so it sounds cleaner. You're not hearing it ringing on longer over time. You're hearing it play what it's supposed to and settle faster. So it's always something that's cleaner. And when you see guys on the internet posting about how their speaker sounded after it was burned in, what the effect was, it's almost 100% every time you hear them say it sounds so much smoother now. It sounds more relaxed. It is cleaner sounding, or the bass has more texture to it now that it's burned in. It's always the same thing. You never hear them say, oh, it got harsh to listen to, hard to listen to after burning, because that doesn't happen. It's always the other way around, because those are the audible effects of what's happening when the speaker burns in. Next questions we'll get is, how do you burn in a speaker? Or what's the best way to burn one in? Just play it. Just play it with some music and let it play. Get some time on it. If you're listening to an inexpensive speaker, budget speaker, you're on a home theater system, receiver, things like that, you may not notice much. You may set things up, watch a movie, the thing plays for weeks, you come back, you watch another movie, you're not going to notice any difference at all. When you're listening to some of your music, you may notice a little bit of difference on your budget systems. You may not. On some of the higher end systems, higher resolution, higher quality stuff, you may notice the difference pretty easily, and the difference in some cases is very significant, especially with some of those capacitors where it's using a Teflon film or a wax paper film or something like that that takes a long time to burn in. A lot of those capacitors can take 500 hours from to really settle in, and sometimes the sound is very drastically different over that time period. It may sound really stringent up front and a little harder to listen to, and you think, I don't know about this, and then hundreds of hours later you think, wow, that thing's really coming around. It's smoothed out a lot. And that happens on some of the expensive capacitors, and it's not that subtle. But my recommendation is play that stuff, let it burn in. If you're adamant about trying to get it there fast, just let it burn in 24/7. You know, the harder you work it, the more signal you're pushing through it, the faster it's going to really work that suspension and loosen it up, and the quicker the changes are going to take place. Another thing that's popular is you set up a speaker, and they'll set the other speaker right in front of it so they're face to face, and then just flip the phase on one of them so that the woofers are doing this to each other, and that will cancel out the sound that you hear quite a bit, especially if you just throw a blanket over it. You can beat on those things and let them go, and they make very little sound, and they can just sit there and burn in all week, and then you can set them up and listen to them, and that way you don't really have to listen to them through the burn-in period if you don't want to. But usually a lot of speakers, especially those budget level with budget gear, even the mid-fi level, just enjoy the speakers. Just set them up and start listening to them. They will smooth out. They will start to sound better. You will notice along the way, wow, from yesterday that they played all night, they do sound smoother today. Just set them up and let them go and enjoy it, and don't worry about it. Speakers are going to burn in. That's a fact. It's not a myth, and it's not a big deal. It's not a scam. There's nothing to gain from the scam. It's just simple physics of it. So, I know it's a hot topic. If you want to post some comments, post some comments. If you want to do some bashing or be combative or argumentative about it, just go to one of those websites out there somewhere and you guys have fun. But I want to make this just about being educational, and I hope you guys learned something from it. I hope you guys appreciate it. I enjoy doing the videos. Hopefully I'm getting a little better at it. That's it for this week. We'll have a new topic next week. Who knows what we'll cover. That's it. Have a good one, guys. See you next week.